Echoing everyone else's gratitude for the event organizers and for putting this panel together. I'll be talking mostly about two legal initiatives related to this issue, but I want to start with a brief explanation of why the Asian Law Caucus in San Francisco is involved in this issue. We're the oldest Asian American civil rights organization in the US, and we originally started getting involved in national security issues in the 80s when the organization filed a motion to overturn the conviction of Fred Korematsu, who's one of the Japanese American citizens detained during World War II. And his case went all the way to the Supreme Court, where he lost in one of the most infamous decisions in history. So after 9/11, the same organization became focused on the post-9/11 discrimination and impact on civil rights of Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, and South Asian organizations. And based on what we've observed with respect to students and faculty on campuses and the severe chilling effect that they face, not only when they speak about Israel and Palestine, but often on broader US foreign policy issues in the Middle East, we see those two issues now under the First Amendment as one of the priority civil rights issues in the post-9/11 environment. And it's important to us too because many of the students who come from communities that face the brunt of US foreign policy not only are facing an injustice there, but a second injustice altogether when they're robbed of their voices and their ability to draw attention to those issues. So a lot of what we talk about, Dima mentioned that so far many of these legal attacks have been unsuccessful, and that's really true in a strict formal legal sense. They haven't been found to be valid on their legal merits, but they have been successful in another way, which is in creating an environment in which anyone venturing into this area is worried about government investigation, even if it ultimately leads to no direct negative consequence. You have that entire period where nobody wants to be under investigation, right? So if there's anything you can do to avoid it, you will do that, and that often results in avoiding protected speech or expressing yourself on important issues. So one of the big issues under this comes under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is one of the most important civil rights statutes in the US, and it restricts recipients of federal funding from discriminating against people on the basis of race, color, and national origin in their use of that fund. Most institutions of higher learning in the US, both public and private, receive federal funding, so they're bound by this statute. And what has happened is that this process has been abused by a few organizations around the country who have cast really political objections to what pro-Palestinian student groups and faculty are saying on campus, and cast it as a civil rights complaint. And it comes in under the language of a hostile environment. So if students are engaging in pro-Palestinian expression on campus, or if faculty departments are sponsoring panels or showing films on campus, all of a sudden you hear this claim that those acts on campus, that discourse on campus, creates a hostile environment for students in violation of their civil rights. This pattern actually traces back to 2004 when the first complaint was filed against UC Irvine, and then it was kind of put on hold, nothing much happened to it, but then there was a second wave of complaints starting in 2010, where UC Berkeley, UC Santa Cruz, Barnard College, Rutgers University, Columbia University all faced Title VI investigations by the U.S. Department of Education on these complaints. And I want to go into some detail about what these complaints actually consisted of, because I think it really makes clear that they're not civil rights issues at the end of the day. So in 2011, a UC Berkeley alumna sued the university alleging that it failed to mitigate a hostile environment against Jewish students on the basis of race, and she said that that environment was caused specifically by the Muslim Student Association and by Students for Justice in Palestine, who were described as organizations with pro-terrorist agendas, with links to Hamas and every single group on the list that you can think of, even the ones that hate each other. And so the complaints themselves really self-consciously are invoking the broader anti-Arab and anti-Muslim environment in the US to justify themselves. But here's what is actually written in her complaint filed with the court. So I'm switching it to third person. So she describes the frenzy, and she's describing what is a common tactic on campuses, a mock military checkpoint, where students wear costumes and pretend to be Israeli soldiers, and some people play the part of Palestinian civilians crossing the checkpoint. And so she says she describes the frenzy of those military uniforms and people carrying realistic assault weapons. The soldiers holding realistic assault weapons and other participants shouted and yelled at passing students. Prepare to be stopped. What is your religion? The first time she was stopped, she was absolutely terrified. No one before had ever stopped her while carrying an assault rifle and yelling. She was ashamed and she was terrified for weeks. So this is the basis for the civil rights complaint against UC Berkeley. And when you read it, you really have to ask yourself, is this a Palestinian in the West Bank reporting their experience at a checkpoint, or is this somebody talking about activism on campus, right? So if this drama, which by the way is being misrepresented out of all proportion, is so terrible, then surely the real thing must be much worse. But in fact, this is actually prototypical of the kinds of complaints that we're seeing around the country. And most of the time, actually pretty much all the time, we're not talking about bona fide hate speech on campus. We're not talking about a situation where there are student groups on campus, spreading anti-Jewish slurs, spreading anti-Jewish stereotypes and themes, like stuff that no one would hesitate to describe as hate speech and anti-Semitic, but we're really talking about these traditional forms of activism and expression. So in the UC system and in California, while this lawsuit was going on, while 3 UC campuses were under federal investigation based on similar complaints, you had a campus climate report published by the University of California system, which described, it basically blamed what it called the pro-Palestinian movement on campus for creating a hostile environment for Jewish students. It had many problems to go with it, but the examples of activity that created that hostile environment were things like describing Israeli policies as racist or apartheid and so on. And the California state legislature followed that with a resolution that passed unanimously and with no debate, describing the following statements as examples of anti-Semitism that should not receive any support on campus. So people shouldn't be allowed to use spaces on campus to make these statements. Israel is a racist or apartheid state. That's the example. Israel is guilty of heinous crimes against humanity, such as ethnic cleansing and genocide. Those are the examples, right? So the question is not, and this is actually an important issue, I think, for the movement in general here. The issue is not, are these claims true or false? That's one set of questions, right? Is it valid to hold this point of view? But a separate institutional question, which is, should universities permit other people to discuss the merits of those claims on campus? And so you kind of have to think about it and then start deploying 2 different arguments and 2 different discourses there. But it's a huge leap, regardless of whether you agree with the statements, it's a huge leap to saying that simply discussing those topics on campus creates a hostile environment for students. So with these complaints, and I'll get into some more specific examples of what kinds of activities were alleged to create these hostile environments later, but with these complaints, I think there are 3 major problems. I won't go into too much detail on 2 of them, but one is this false characterization of Jewish students as a monolithic whole who all feel one way about this issue and don't have diverse opinions between themselves. It just simply does not reflect the reality on campus, and that's something that has been voiced by a number of people who criticize these reports and investigations. But and 2 is that they, as I mentioned earlier, they totally misrepresent and hyperbolize what's going on campus. So these mock checkpoints, for example, in the language of the complaints, were analogized to passion plays in Europe, which is just like ludicrous. But the third, and that I think is most relevant for universities, is this implication that people in a university setting should refrain from discussing issues if they upset the quote-unquote climate, or if they make students feel somewhat uncomfortable. So the language here of civil rights laws, which are meant to protect against racial and sexual harassment on campus, are hijacked in order to target political views and to silence a political debate. But it really raises the question, well, 2 things it does. It raises the question, the entire point of a protest is to disrupt the campus climate, right? Disrupt the climate in general, to raise attention to a problem with the status quo. But the second issue is, maybe I'll get to that in a minute. The second issue is if you're not going to discuss these issues on campus, where are you going to discuss this, right? So a lot of this has come in under the guise of civility. Earlier this year, UC Berkeley Chancellor released a statement, espousing the virtues of civility on campuses, in which he says, when issues are inherently divisive, controversial, and capable of arousing strong feelings, the commitment to free speech and expression can lead to division and divisiveness that undermine a community's foundation. So in other words, divisive issues should not be discussed on campus, or we should tread carefully when doing so. And it doesn't make sense as a rule for campus. Maybe for your Thanksgiving dinner next week, you avoid those hot-button issues. But on campus, that's where you learn. Where else are students going to learn about divisive issues other than campus? Is it from television commentators? Well, that's not great analysis. Is it from politicians who have other interests aside from expressing their own feelings? They have to worry about voters. They've got to worry about donors. It just totally turns on its head the point of a university. So I'll go into a couple more examples that Dima had mentioned, and then I'll shift to the more recent congressional issue related to funding Middle East Studies centers. But as Dima showed good examples of, the hostile climate discourse has been used against very, I would say, relatively mundane speech. So that banner at Barnard College, for example, a lot of the rhetoric against that was that it makes students feel unsafe as if they're facing harassment and intimidation on campus, simply seeing that image. Those leaflets at Northeastern that led to expulsion, the same argument has been deployed against those leaflets at Harvard, at NYU, at Yale, at Florida Atlantic University, University of Chicago. It's happened at so many different places. So one of the harms in this, it might seem petty, but one of the harms of this is that even when the complaints aren't legally meritorious, you have all these university administrators who don't want to face the prospect of a federal investigation because it harms their prestige. They don't want to face the prospect of losing federal funds, and so they overreact to student activism on campus and ends up stifling people's ability to discuss these issues. Shifting to the Higher Education Act. So Title VI of the Higher Education Act has been in place since the mid-50s, and it provides federal funding to area studies programs at universities around the country. And the purpose is to support U.S. Foreign interests by having people within this country who know about the rest of the world. And recently what we've seen is two organizations, one based here in DC called the Brandeis Center, and one in California called the Al-Arian Initiative, have published reports claiming that these centers, the Al-Arian Initiative, AMCHA, these reports, they claim that the academic centers are, quote, hostile to the United States, the West, and Israel. We're talking about Middle East studies in particular. That they are not, quote unquote, not working as an effective pipeline to intelligence and national security agencies. And so they're calling upon Congress in the reauthorization cycle to add language that either defunds the centers altogether or gives power to the U.S. Department of Education, which disperses these funds, to review the content of academic programs to ensure that they have balanced perspectives, meaning a more, rather than having scholars who are writing based on what they see as an accurate view of the situation, scholars are trying to get a quota, quote unquote pro, whatever that means, Israel, and quote unquote, well, they don't want the second one. But in their reports, the best precedent that they cite for this is an effort by President Nixon to defund foreign area studies in the 70s as a result of academics who opposed the Vietnam War. So it's really clear that it's political motivation here. But the suggestions are also radically at odds with First Amendment rights that have been clearly established because of those repression tactics that were used in the 50s, 60s, and 70s against the emerging civil rights movement. So there's a lot of Supreme Court rhetoric that we can tap into in mobilization efforts against these programs that work quite well into our favor on these issues, talking about how the exclusion of governmental intervention in the intellectual life of the university is necessary to preserve free universities. And it doesn't matter whether that intervention is avowed or to action that inevitably tends to check the ardor and fearlessness of scholars. But as a lot of people in Middle East studies, especially those that aren't tenured or are still graduate students, you don't want to study a number of issues because people tell you you're not viable if you do that. And then the last thing I'll note is that the factual basis for these calls is just totally grossly distorts what's actually happening. So the main focal point of the most recent calls is UCLA Center for Near East Studies, against which a report was published 2 months ago claiming that 93% of their events exhibit quote-unquote anti-Israel bias and 75% reflect anti-Semitism. UCLA has published its own rebuttal, which is quite good, but you can guess the usual problems with the report. Their definition of bias being so broad it includes events co-hosted by J Street, on campus. Their definition of anti-Semitism being so broad that it includes the following statement. They actually have an appendix of examples and includes, a speaker stated that Israel was created through colonialism. That is an anti-Semitic statement. And then the lack of perspective. So I think it's helpful to bring these other issues in as well, but when we focus only on this within the parameters of Israel and Palestine, we lose sight of the broader implications of this, which make no sense in any other context. So by suggesting that there's a disproportionate critical focus on Israel, they are suggesting that Middle East scholars in general love the other governments in the Middle East as if they're not critical of those as well, right? So just a listing of those events at UCLA, for example, stopping the nuclear threat from Iran, Egypt, stillborn revolution, they don't sound like pro-government events. So I will leave the rest for questions. Thank you.